Kia ora and welcome to the second episode of the Sonic Speculations podcast. I'm your host, Nathaniel Otley, and today I have the pleasure of talking to New Zealand Greek composer John Psathas. John Psathas shot to worldwide attention when his music was heard by more than 1 billion people during the opening ceremony of the Athens 2004 Olympic Games. The New Zealand Arts Foundation laureate has since achieved a phenomenal level of international success, having reached concert audiences in more than 50 countries on 7 continents, including Antarctica. He is now also considered one of the 3 most important living composers of the Greek diaspora. He has collaborated on a Billboard classical chart-topping album with System of a Down frontman Serge Tankian, written feature film scores, collaborated with the Grand Mufti in Paris's Grand Mosque, crossed into jazz projects with luminaries Michael Brecker and Joshua Redman, and collaborated on an e-book project with Salman Rushdie. These examples show the boundary-crossing nature of Psathas' work that has led to much international success. He says his journey is best described as an explosion of collaborations with artists from dozens of musical traditions spanning Asia, Europe, North and South America, Africa, and Australasia. In New Zealand, Psathas won the 2002 and 2004 Sounds Contemporary Awards, with the works View from Olympus and 3 Psalms. Other works, and there are too many here to list examples, have been performed extensively by New Zealand artists, both in New Zealand and internationally. In 2019, Psathas closed the door on 25 years of teaching at Victoria University of Wellington to devote his time to composing and to embark on a return to performing on stage. He is also currently in the second year of a 3-year residency with Orchestra Wellington, a residency that has led to the performance of works both old and new. Percussion has always been a strong feature of Psathas' output, with a consistent schedule of new percussion commissions from many of the world's top players. COVID-19 also served to further broaden the scope of his work with the 2020 release of long-distance collaborative albums It's Already Tomorrow and Last Days of March. If you enjoy this interview, please like, rate, review, and indeed share it. It helps to grow our audience. In addition, please subscribe to get new episodes in the manner that best suits you. We are now available on YouTube as well as all other podcasting platforms. If neither of these options suit you, you can also opt in to receive an email each time we publish an episode. Subscribe at nathanielOtley.com/sonic speculations. As is always the case, you can find a list of links to recordings, websites, and other material of interest in the episode description. If you'd like to, please get in touch at sonicspeculations@gmail.com. I'd love to hear feedback from people who are listening to the project. And I'm joined now by John Psathas. Kia ora, John.
Hi, Nathaniel. Nice to be with you.
Great to talk to you. So something we like to do with all our composers is ask, how did you first come to composition? What was the process? Did you start out wanting to be a composer, or was that something that you came to after being involved in music for several years?
I think the most accurate answer to that is that composing for me grew out of improvisation. So that when I was, I would say about 11, I started playing the piano with no education on the instrument. And I just found sound and I played, and I really enjoyed it, and I would spend hours playing. And after a while, my parents decided I needed piano lessons, and I started to learn other people's music by going to piano lessons. And then I advanced really fast, which was a surprise to everybody. So I started touching the instrument at 11. And then by the time I was 16, I had my ATCL. So, it was quite fast. And I auditioned for university at the end of year 12 when I was at high school, and I was accepted into the performance program at Victoria University. And my aim, I think it's because my parents understood it as a possible career, was to be a performing musician, because there's a kind of regularity and a clarity around fees and things when it comes to performing. Whereas composing is an incredibly vague thing to talk to your parents about when you're that age. So I went to university to be a classical pianist, and I did actually get a degree in piano performance. But at the same time, I enrolled in composition. And when I landed at Victoria University, there were 3 lecturers in composition there. There was Ross Harris, Jack Boddy, and David Farquhar. And that sort of trio was so wildly contrasting in their approaches that it was a kind of incredible way to start. There was no conformity or uniformity in the approach. And by the time I got to the end of the degree in piano, I had written quite a bit of music as a student as well. I got a double major. When I went on to honours, which I always, for some reason, knew that I was going to do, I decided I wanted to do composition. And in fact, the school decided that composition would be better for me than performance as well. So I went on and did honours in composition and then a master's in composition. And back then, to do those 3 degrees took 6 years. So it was 3 + 1 + 2 to get to the end of a master's. So I was actually 6 years a composition student.
Oh, wonderful. So you mentioned this improvisation being important and how it grew out of that. Can you maybe talk a little more about that? Like, when did you start actually improvising, and is that still important to your practice, or was it just something that composition grew out of?
So at the beginning, I was, just going into high school, and there was a competition that was run. It's still run, but it's called something else. Back then, it was called the Westpac Chamber Music Competition. Now I just think it's the Chamber Music Competition of New Zealand, run by Chamber Music New Zealand. And they had a composition category. It was just starting up back then. And so I thought, oh, there's an opportunity. I'll try and turn some of these improvisations into a composition that I can then submit to this competition. And so I put together a bunch of improvisations. I remember I called it random selections, which tells you pretty much everything about the structure of the work. And I think another piece I wrote was called like jukebox selections, because it just kept changing, piece. But so there was if you think about it though, it's a terrific impetus by an organization to make available to aspiring, people who don't even think they might be composers, giving you an opportunity to kind of collate and structure some of the material you're working with. But going back to your other question about improvisation and whether I still use it as a catalyst for work, sometimes. But the thing is that I'm not very good at it, and I never was. The thing is, I went through that early period that I think most people go through, where it was very soulful pounding of the instrument, and doing the A minor, G major, F major progression, doing all of that, really feeling it. I had a lot of that, and I'm very grateful for it, because it opened up to me how one can feel through the making of music. So that was very important. But now it's interesting. I've just written my first solo piece in a long time, a solo piano piece. And I did actually sit at the piano for quite a while to figure things out. But that was really more a kind of a visceral exchange with the instrument, rather, because I can't play the things that I write. My ability as a player are way below the abilities of the people that I write for. And so improvisation is really a way of getting emotional color and potential progressions and trajectories, rather than very specific things. Actually, one thing I might add to that, just in terms of the beginning, is that I had a very sort of particular kind of upbringing, which is the young immigrant child. So my parents came from Greece, and I grew up in places like Taumarunui, a very small place, especially in the 60s, and then in Napier. And my sister and I just worked constantly in the shop. That was the way it was. There are other cultures that do that, Italian and Chinese and so on, where the kids are really part of the work culture of the family. And looking back, I realized actually it was awful. It was awful to be caught up in working like that your entire childhood. And even at high school, working every evening of the week, while all my teenage friends were actually doing what you're supposed to do as a teenager, which is go out, go to parties, get to know members, or significant others, anyway, all of that stuff. And so what happened was I discovered music at a young age, like at 11, 12, and I started listening to music, and it just had such a profound impact on me. And I was pretty non-selective. I would just grab the records that were in the house and listen to them. And I started listening through the night. I started getting really addicted to it. And we would finish work at like 2 a.m, because our restaurant and stuff was open very late. And we would go home and everybody would be wiped out and go to bed. But I would actually turn all the lights off, go into the living room, put the headphones on, and then throw on whatever records there were and gradually work my way through the library. And within a few months, I'd listen to everything. And I had a small collection of about 6 albums that I then proceeded to listen to over and over and over again. And that's when I realized how music could make me feel. And in that small collection, there was an album of Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata, and I really didn't have time for the opening movement. It was really all about the last movement, the incredibly exciting last movement. For me, that was just every night. I would listen to that every night. And there was like an Alan Parsons album there. I think it was called Pyramid, and you may not have heard of Alan Parsons, but big deal at the time. And really conceptual kind of pop music. It was really amazing. And it had orchestra in it and all kinds of other things. And I just became addicted, and I discovered Keith Jarrett, improvising pianist at that time. And so I gradually just slipped into this space over the course of a few years of listening like this, where there was nothing else for me aside from making music. There was no other option, and there was never going to be another choice. And I would say from that moment to now, talking to you, there's been an absolutely uninterrupted line of pursuit of getting better and better and better at expressing through musical sound.
So what was you said you were at university studying for 6 years. What was your experience immediately post-study?
I had a fantastic transition. So when I was writing my master's works, two very important things happened. One is I wrote a piece that is still alive, which is amazing. It's called Waiting for the Airplane, a little piano piece, right? And then the other thing is one of my other master's projects, I think it was called Timeline, which was some bizarre big project for dancers and live band and stuff. I had the temerity to apply to Creative New Zealand for some funding for that at the time. And I don't think I was supposed to, because I think if it was part of your study, you weren't supposed to apply for other funding as well. But I did anyway. And I actually got a small amount of money. That was the first commission I got. And the kind of impact on my thinking about myself as a composer, by getting that affirmation from Creative New Zealand at that stage in my journey, was profound. I thought, oh my God, I'm being taken seriously by people that don't know me, because I didn't have a track record of any kind either at that time. So those two things were kind of a big deal for me. And then what happened immediately after finishing university is I traveled for 2 years with my partner, who's now my wife, Carla, and we lived for a year in Atlanta, Georgia, in America, and then another year in Brussels, in Belgium. And during those 2 years, I essentially just had moved fluidly into full-time commissions. It's amazing that it worked out so quickly. And from the time I finished my university degrees till now, I've essentially been commissioned continuously all year, every year. The exceptions are the years that I had children, where as everybody's output just drops dramatically in the first year of your child's life. But so the 2 years after university, the travel and living in other places and just writing music was amazing. And in Brussels, I met up with a fantastic composer who I'd met here in New Zealand called Jacqueline Fontaine, Belgian composer. And Jacqueline had just retired from a massive career as a professor in composition at the Brussels Conservatoire. And then when we arrived in Brussels, I said to Jacqueline, look, I'm here. Is there any chance of having some private lessons? And I went to see her semi-regularly, maybe twice a month. It was all very casual. And we would just walk through her orchard looking at scores of Bartok, and talking about them. And she would set me these exercises to do in front of her, where she would write 3 notes of a major triad, and she would put, flute, oboe, bassoon next to the notes. And she would say, stare at that until you can hear it. And I would look at it, and eventually I'd be able to. It really was hard because I didn't have the training for it. Then she'd say, great. And then she'd do it again, change the instruments. She'd say, now stare at it until you can hear it. And I was just really, really, I think, inspired by coming into contact with somebody that was so clearly the outcome of that European tradition. It was absolutely the product of those hundreds of years of intense music making on that continent. That was a really special gift for me. And then I came back to New Zealand, started teaching at university, and that's really the journey.
So you mentioned Timeline being a sort of a dance and musical sort of extravaganza.
Yeah.
That's possibly, from what I can see, maybe an early example of a multimedia project, something that you have done quite a lot of. Where does this interest in sort of large-scale multimedia projects do you think that comes from, and what are the more significant ones throughout your career that you've been involved in?
Well, that's a great question, because for me, because I think that, I was born into an era where at the beginning of my journey, pure music, pure abstract music still had a huge amount of currency, right? So writing a new string quartet or a symphony was still considered really important and really vital. But during the course of my journey, getting to today, I walk into meetings with, say, festival directors who are planning whole programs of works, and have heard very clearly stated in these meetings, look, it's just not enough to put a string quartet up on a stage and have people listen to new works. It's just not enough anymore. We need more than that. And that's basically been the gradual evolution of writing music for me, has been this idea that it's not so much that it needs more than just the music, but there's a huge amount of expressive and communicative opportunity in adding other layers to a musical composition and integrating it with other kinds of media. And so it started off with just, it'd be great to add like dances or, whatever. But it's gotten to the point now that I'm free of academia and I'm not part of a university system, it's led to a point now where it's become hugely important to me to have these other dimensions in the works. So I'm now producing new works that have projected text, and they have also pre-recorded sound. That's become a big thing of a lot of the works that I'm writing. And the pre-recorded sound is more, in some ways, documentary type sound, in that it's evoking aspects of the world and life that essentially can't be brought out of abstract music making. And it's bringing extra musical and more kind of literal expressions and meanings into the experience of a piece of music, because I think I've gotten to the point now where I want things to matter more. And the idea of writing a pure string quartet, which I'm going to do next year, which I'm really looking forward to, so I haven't given up on these things, but it feels like when I go to write another piece that I've got next year, which is solo piano plus projected text and audio, a whole lot of audio information, it feels like I'll be able to communicate a much greater palette of ideas and concepts. And the other thing is, just to round that off, is I've noticed in the presentation of these works that audiences have a different, and in some ways, I think, more satisfying and fulfilling and challenging kind of experience.
So how does a piece come into existence for you? Is there a method, or is there a way you go about composing that is standard, or is it different depending on the piece?
Well, if you think about writing any piece of music, really what you're doing is you're starting from a place of infinite possibility, and you're collapsing those possibilities to something that's manageable. So, for me, the scariest thing is to think of sitting down at my desk, computer, piano, whatever, and not having anything in mind and just thinking, oh, I'm going to write a piece of music with absolutely nothing there. So for me, the way that it comes into being, and I've been very lucky that I've been continually commissioned from actually just the last part of being a student until today. And so that's very important, because it qualifies this answer, which is that every single piece I've written, there's been like one exception, every single piece I've written has come from a defined set of criteria within a commission. And what that means is only and nothing more than the duration of the piece and the instrumentation. So those two things are locked in place before I start any piece of music. And also the third thing is a deadline. So there's a time when I have to deliver it by. So I start with those three things, and that's great because it collapses a huge amount of logistical possibilities into something that I can get my head around. And then I'm free to create within that. And so, for instance, I just finished in the process of finishing a solo piano piece. And the commissioner of that, Corey Ham, he sent me about 30 pieces to listen to with scores and recordings. And he said, you might find these interesting. And they were all immensely virtuosic pieces of music. Things that I didn't think were possible, like crazy writing for the piano, and just amazing. And I thought, well, if that's the permission I'm being given by being given those pieces by the commissioner, I felt I had some license. And so going into that work, and just from the very beginning, I was thinking, I can go for it. So that's one way of going into a piece. Another way is a conceptual way, where I finished a piece recently for 6 pianos and pre-recorded, which was premiered at the Auckland Arts Festival this year. And when I wrote that piece, I spent about 3 or 4 months actually working out a huge concept of what it meant, what it was about, what would be in the backing track. It was a, what do you call it? It was a preconceived extra musical concept for a work, and thinking of the 6 pianos and how playing might move around and all of those things as well. And so that's concept driving it. And then another different example might be writing a piece that is maybe I'm in a certain place in my life where everything is going badly for the people around me, like my family and my family in Greece. And I look at the world and it feels awful. Everything that's going on in the world is just, how can we not be only talking about climate? How can we possibly be talking about anything else? Those sorts of zones that you go into. And all of that becomes this sort of, I don't know, a state. And that state will define the piece, sometimes because it's overwhelming. And I let that happen. I don't fight that, because the thing is that there is no predetermined, preferred, ideal outcome. Every piece is a way of going through time and in some ways capturing your journey, whatever it might be, and consolidating in this piece of music.
How does your approach to writing change based on the sort of scale of the project?
Yeah. Well, the interesting thing is that like if I write for orchestra, I write vertically, right? So the whole orchestra is being composed for as you go forward. I don't do piano reductions and then orchestrate. It's just, the whole orchestra is being composed for at the same, all at once. So what that means is when writing for orchestra, one is dealing with a massive sound palette, like a massive logistical management of all of these players. And what I've found is the difference between doing that and working on a solo piece is that in the solo work, a lot more of the time that's available for writing the piece is in the detail. It's in the minutiae. You can go in and go, actually, what if I just phrase that this way or change the order of these things? And there's a lot more time to go back and play with things and go, actually, this section here, it comes nicely out of before and it goes nicely into what's next, but actually it needs to balloon out a bit in the middle, right? And I think what I'm describing, I'm figuring this out as I say it, is that I think what I'm saying is there's more room for going back and doing things in smaller pieces, smaller ensemble pieces. Whereas with orchestra, I feel probably more pressure to be getting it right as I go through the piece. So those are quite different ways of moving through time creatively. The other thing, though, to say is that obviously, if you know any of my music, you'll know that I strive for a kind of intensity, and that's not any different in any of the contexts that I write for. So I'm always pushing I feel like I'm pushing the end of the bubble in terms of really trying to grab you and shake you and go, listen, 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 listen. I'm doing that in whatever context I'm writing.
So you have always been a user of, an advocate for, and indeed a teacher of computer technology and music. What has the ever-improving nature of technology meant for or changed about your practice over the course of your career?
Well, I reckon you could probably go through and look at all of the work I've written since I was a student until today and plot a graph of identical lines that show an evolution of my writing that is absolutely parallel to the evolution of technology, because I've been completely immersed in it from the very beginning. And I think technology for me, more than anything, has been a way of escaping two major limitations for a composer, for me as a composer. And one is the limitation of not being able to play what you write, or maybe only being able to write what you can play, which for me would be a massive handicap. And then the other is only being able to write what you can hear in your own head, right? Because I can't imagine the music that I write without hearing it. I need to be able to hear it as I'm writing it. And that's because I do a lot of this writing of micro interactions between layers moving through time, often at high speed. And I spend a lot of time managing the delivery rate of information so that I'm trying to keep pace with the listener in the same way that filmmakers keep pace with the audience's understanding of everything that's going on in a film. So I'm very conscious of how much can be absorbed going through time. And in order to do that, when you're working at high speed and the music is intense and busy and so on, it can only be achieved by hearing it. I mean, there are big geniuses around that can do it in their head, but I absolutely can't do that. And so technology has enabled me essentially to write beyond, firstly, what I can imagine, and secondly, what I can perform. So it's like a compositional prosthetic. That's how I think of it.
And with that technology, obviously it's changed a lot since when you were studying.
Mm-hmm.
What do you think are the main technological advances that have sort of come along and enhanced your practice?
Well, if you put aside the more boring stuff, which is the way that the internet's evolved, and you can have file transfers, storage, backups, all of those sorts of, and communication, of course, all of those sorts of things. The kind of musical side of it is that essentially the digital audio workstations and the sound libraries have evolved, exponentially, so that now I can have samples of a whole string section all doing quiet tremolo and random players within the group popping out with crescendos and little popping things. And so I can sort of have that on demand and then figure out how to transcribe it and write it out. There's almost no limitation. I mean, still you can't get a solo violin performing in a way that sounds like a real performance. And I hope that never happens. I hope that we still need the great violinist to play that music. But in general, for ensemble music, and especially for percussion, because percussion samples are really great, it's possible to write. And maybe actually that's part of the answer to another question of why so much percussion. Maybe it's because the percussion sample libraries were ahead of the other libraries, in terms of the evolution.
So what has COVID meant for your compositional practice? While obviously it will have restricted your travel, you, from my perspective, seem from your previous international collaborative projects, such as Between Zero and One, to have had a really useful preparation for the current situation, particularly in terms of, using video, from across the world in your projects.
Well, actually, I have to say that COVID for me has been the busiest and fertile and productive time that I've ever experienced. In the last 18 months, I've written a phenomenal amount of music and have also taken on board projects now that see me through to the end of 2023. So, there's a lot of work coming my way, really, really amazing projects for me. And during the time of COVID, I've had performances in 35 countries. There's been a lot going on during all of that time. So it hasn't slowed me down. I think maybe being stuck here, as I have been, has increased my work rate and my ability to commit to things and finish things. So it's actually been a very, very intense time, COVID. And I think you're right about all of my previous work setting me up well, because you mentioned Between Zero and One. That's one example, but in general, I would say 90% of my projects involve long distance collaboration and communication. And so it all feels very natural to do that now.
How does collaboration work? How does that normally work when you're working with someone? Is that is that a matter of sending things to them, or do you talk relatively in depth with them first, or how do you approach compositional collaboration?
It's a great question, and quite a complex one for me, in that for me collaboration is really a person-to-person collaboration. It's not a composer-to-performer collaboration. And so I need to get to know the person that I'm working with and writing for. And, I need to know that they're the kind of person that's going to enjoy playing what I write. That's one of the first things. And I have to say openly, I never ask for feedback on the writing. I will ask for feedback on the technical side of it, the playability. So for instance, I've just finished a solo piano piece for a wonderful pianist in America, Corey Ham, and I'm just in the process of, I'm just about to start the score because I've written the piece, and I'm going to write it out very carefully and figure out all of the fingerings of everything to make sure that it's as playable as possible. And then I'll send it to him and ask him for feedback on the playability. But it's always been my way that if a performer's not happy with the work, like if they say, actually, I don't like this, I don't want it, it's totally okay. And I will offer to refund the commission fee and keep the piece, and then maybe offer it to somebody else. It's never happened, but that's been my position. But in terms of collaboration, for instance, I've just finished a piece for a percussionist in Germany, Alexei Gerasimis, and he's about to play it in a month's time. It's called Leviathan, and it's a massive, massive project. I met with Alexei in Berlin in 2019, and we looked at instruments because one of the things that we wanted to do was include junk in the piece, like trash, because there's a theme and concept to the piece about the environment and so on. So, and he does a cadenza on a plastic water bottle and stuff like that. So, we explored a whole lot of sounds, and I filmed them and recorded them, made sample libraries and all that stuff. But that was it. And then I wrote the piece and sent him a finished work. And I said, if there's anything unplayable, please tell me. So that's really the essence of the collaboration in a musical sense, but on a personal level, I need to get to know the person. So Alexi and I were, we're having meals together, having beers together. I met his family. We got to know each other. All of that stuff is hugely important for me, way more important, because I feel like what I'm doing is creating for a person's energy and for their kind of life force. That's what it's about for me. And so what that's meant is that I've made a lot of friends this way, because I've met really amazing people that I want to give of myself to, because writing a piece of music for somebody is a very personal, intimate thing to do. So that's kind of a way of defining what it's like.
So you mentioned this piece, Leviathan. It's a particularly massive percussion setup you've got going in that work. How's that going to work? It's got its premiere next month in Germany. How's that going to work with regards to the COVID situation? Is there still distancing over there, or has that been an obstacle you've had to overcome, or is things pretty much back to normal?
I just actually 2 days ago received word from the Berlin Radio Orchestra, who are premiering it in Berlin and in Hamburg, and they said they've just been given permission to go ahead, with the concerts. So the concerts will go ahead as normal concerts over there. But up until 2 days ago, it was actually possible that it wouldn't happen. So that's the situation is that it's an either or. But I'm really, really pleased that they're going ahead, of course. And Alexei will be super pleased because of the work that he's done learning this crazy music. So I just had another piece recorded that I wrote for the Cologne Philharmonie and a quartet of percussionists. The group's called Percussion. And this piece is called Orbital. And it's on an even bigger scale than the thing I've done with Alexei. 4 percussionists, full orchestra, backing track, like huge, huge backing track, live electronics. There's all this stuff going on in there. And they made a recording, and they rented a special venue for the recording where everybody was able to be socially distanced, the entire orchestra. So the footprint of the orchestra for that recording was absolutely huge because they had to spread out, but it still happened. So people are finding solutions to things.
We've sort of managed to find our way into talking about percussion. It's something that you've written a lot for, and I know when I think about your music, often what I immediately go to is percussion. What is it about percussion that resonates with you as a person and a composer?
Yeah, I think it's really about following one's nose, and when I left university, one of the first commissions I received was for a piece called Matrice Dance. And that's done extremely well in the world. That's become a standard piece for percussion repertoire. And it's been played thousands of times. I've got like 3 pieces that have taken off in this way in percussion. And of course, if you write a piece when you're young and it's that successful, the logical thought is, I'll try and write another piece. That's like that. And so, and I had that piece launched by Evelyn Glennie. It was written for 2 wonderful musicians here, Bruce McKinnon and David Guerin. But Evelyn picked it up when she came to the festival and then just toured it all over the world. And she herself, I think, has probably played it over 1,000 times in the last 30 years because it goes back that far. And because of that, I suggested to Evelyn that I write a piece for her, which I did. And then I ended up writing a concerto, a double concerto for her, which was View from Olympus. And during that period of time, the other works had kind of been picked up, and I started to get more and more interest. And it's just following that lead. That's the professional career answer. The musical answer is that the thing that excites me when I'm writing, and you'll hear this in almost every piece of mine that you listen to, is very fine interaction on a micro level between different elements and different layers. So there's a lot happening. There's a lot of information being delivered in a short space of time, and it's to do with communication between elements within the music. And so in order to do that at tempo, because I also like exciting music, and I like fast music, and I like sort of, visceral, energized music, I sort of inevitably ended up writing for instruments that have very clear attack points and not a lot of resonance, so that you can fit more notes in and there can be more stuff happening between instruments. So piano and percussion are the obvious ones to go to for that. And then there's also the fact that the players of those instruments learn how to play rhythmically very, very tightly and very accurately, and often to click, like all percussionists practice with metronomes. And they go right. If you look at, I mean, I've spent a lot of my journey looking at snare drum etudes, right? because that's where you see the rudiments and the detail that's possible when you write for a percussionist. I mean, so much of what I do in percussion writing is taken from or is grown out of what I've learned through studying snare drum studies.
And so going back to Leviathan, obviously percussion with its very, there's lots of instruments, often they're quite bulky. How do you approach sort of percussion stations in a work such as that? Do you plan them out beforehand, or do you sort out the sort of sonic environment you're trying to create before you sort of draw together various stations? Because obviously writing for percussion in any shape or form is a logistical, there's logistical challenges as well as musical ones that you have to think about.
Yeah. Well, to answer that, I really just have to tell you how I write music, which is that I always start at the beginning of a piece. I don't know what's going to happen. So I don't actually know what percussion instruments I'm going to end up using when I start a piece. At some point in some pieces, I'll go, oh, hang on, that's too much. And so I have to pull back because I've just basically got everything, on stage, and it's never going to happen. So it's interesting because I'm writing next, the very next piece that I'm writing is a double percussion concerto. And this is for Luca Staffelbach and Fabian Ziegler from Switzerland. And I've had a lot to do with Fabian, written a number of pieces for him. And it's the last orchestral piece in my schedule for quite a while. I've said no to a bunch of things for orchestra because I want to get into writing smaller works. But this last orchestral work that I'm writing, this double concerto, I made a decision up front, and I've had to commit to it because I've told the orchestras involved that this is what's happening. It's for Mozart-sized orchestra, and the soloists is to just one plays marimba, one plays vibraphone, and that's it. And so that, for me, when I think about it, I kind of wake up in the night thinking, how am I going to do that? It's only a vibraphone and a marimba, but I'll figure it out. The thing is that it's also an opportunity to try and write a concerto that is its dynamic range is more limited, and that way there's a way of going more into the material and the sound. But yeah, it's this thing with percussion. It's very tempting to pull everything out, to get everything on stage because it looks great, and audience love seeing all of that hardware. And they love seeing percussionists move from station to station. I don't really plan that. What happens is, as I work, I think, logistically, I need to be organized about how this is going to work, and very much thinking, okay, this person actually has to walk 10 steps at least. They've got to put down sticks. They've got to walk over their pickup sticks, find their place in the music, and prepare to play an instrument that sounds almost utterly opposite to the instrument they were playing 2 seconds or 20 seconds ago. So all of that stuff, I try to be way more sympathetic to players than I used to be.
So we'll move on now to our 5 final questions. These are questions we're asking all our interviewees. The first of them is where do you go to be creative? What's a space for you that is particularly creative? Is it a studio, office, outside of those spaces? What is it for you?
I have a place now up in Waitarere, up the coast from Wellington, which is just past Levin. And when I left the university, I had to kind of pay up for my pension, and we put it into this place. And we bought it. It's right by the sea, looks out at the ocean. And I have spent a lot of the last 3 years there composing alone. And the one thing I should say is that I have a lot of capacity, right? So I can work 12-hour days, 20 days in a row, and just write music nonstop. And I've been doing that for the past 3 years and producing what I think is the best I've done so far in terms of the music. So being alone is hugely important in terms of composing. Of course, I have a family. I have kids. Our son is 25, our daughter is 21. So I've had the last 25 years of being interrupted all the time because I have kids. And also, when you have a young family and you're just starting out, you don't have the space you want. Okay, you have the space you get. And so I spent a lot of years, like even when I wrote the music for the Olympics, in the laundry of the house with my little studio set up there and the washing machine and the dryer behind me. So I have learned to work anywhere, but being alone up the coast is just a gift. Like when I'm there, it's just the most amazing thing. And in fact, after this interview, because I'm in Wellington now, I'm getting in the car and going up there to do some work.
Very good. So are there any performances or particular collaborative relationships? You've talked a little bit about this, so there may not necessarily be any more, but do any of those stand out to you?
Well, the performances, obviously sitting in the audience for the Olympics opening ceremony was one of the most mind-blowing experiences, not just because I had something to do with it, but just being there and being a part of that was absolutely incredible. And I was there with my wife, Carla, and we would be hearing stuff happen. And Carla would go, hang on, did you do that? And I'd go, oh, yeah, I did. And we hadn't noticed for like minutes because we were so wrapped up in the whole thing. So that was amazing. And then I did a project, No Man's Land, which a lot of people from a lot of different countries, and we did live shows of that in New Zealand in 2016. And those were amazing, really amazing. And audience reaction to those was absolutely phenomenal. I got the most moving and validating responses to anything that I've done from those performances. They were huge for me, those events. And I think probably one last one to mention, there have been so many, right? But one last one to mention is in an earlier festival in Wellington, the New Zealand String Quartet played a piece of mine called Abhisheka for string quartet and amplification. And they had been playing that piece a lot around the world in the years between my writing it and the festival that I was at just then. And they performed the piece in a way that it revealed things to me about the music that I wasn't aware of before. They knew it. They knew the music and had found things in it, more things in it than I was aware of as the composer. That's actually a really big experience when that happens.
Wonderful. Are there any strange or unusual experiences, things that went slightly awry that stand out that you've had?
Yeah, I have lots of those. Like I have lots of train wreck stories, like being in a concert where things just, and they're the longest minutes of your life, really. But I think one of the really interesting things that happened to me was in I think it was 1995. I went to the Asian Composers League Festival, which was in, that year it was in Thailand, in Bangkok. And I actually played a piece of mine in the young composer competition part of it. I played Matrix Dance with a Thai percussionist. And it went down really well. I got a really great response. And I had this experience where I walked around the back of the hall and I was just going to come back into it from the corridor. And a senior composer there stopped me in the little sort of place between the two doors, this dark place. And he started talking to me. He said that it's the strangest thing. He said, look, just because you got a good response then, it doesn't mean you're a good composer. You need to understand that you mustn't get carried away and think that you have talent because of the way people responded to that performance. And I was lucky enough to have within me this ability at that moment to look at him and go, no, this is all about you. This isn't about me. Because it could have been extremely damaging, that thing. But that was also because it was like in the dark and I didn't know this man. And he was really trying to push me back down, into the ground, because my head had popped up for a while, and I had self-esteem above zero, temporarily, and he was trying to squash it back down. Yeah, that was a very odd thing. And also, I've never really known what to learn from it. So,
any memorable non-composer jobs? You mentioned you worked for many years at your parents.
Yeah.
One.
Well, that would be something I'd like to forget, but a bit too memorable. But I think probably the most memorable job is I had a terrible summer job once, cleaning the operating theatres at Wellington Hospital after the operations, and that was really something.
And finally, are there any reading recommendations you would make?
Yes, absolutely. I'm doing a lot of reading at the moment because I'm off social media. So no Facebook, no Instagram, nothing. And I have found that it's made a big difference to the way my mind works. Because the thing about social media and surfing in general on the internet is that you deal with a lot of superficial levels of information. It might be very important information, but you're only dealing with it at the surface. You're not really going into it. And so I have found since I got off social media that my ability to read harder books has really improved. So I'm reading 4 authors at the moment, and they're all pretty serious. One is Henry Giroux, Giroux. I'd really recommend his books. They're quite hard going, but they are really incredible. They're social commentary mostly, and politics. And Douglas Murray, don't know if you've heard of him. He's written books like The Madness of Crowds, which is really about wokeism and where we're at the moment with things and where it might go. And then Lydia Cacho, who's a Mexican authoress who has written one of her books called Slavery, Inc., which is about the slave trade today, which is massive. It's, I think, the second biggest industry in the world. How it works and so on. That's possibly the worst book I've ever read in terms of the impact that it had on me, but I'm so grateful to know. And then the other one is not really an author. Well, he does write, but he makes documentaries, and that's Adam Curtis, who I would strongly recommend people find. His latest series, which is 8 hours long, which I've watched 3 times already, is called Can't Get You Out of My Head. And it's an emotional history of the 20th century. It's pretty incredible. So I'm doing a lot of reading at the moment, really enjoying it.
Great. Well, it's been fantastic to chat to you today. Thank you so much for your time.
Oh, a real pleasure. Really nice to talk to you.
And that just about concludes the second episode of the Sonic Speculations podcast. I'd like to thank John Psathas for his time and for providing some incredible insights into his compositional practice. If you liked this episode, I would encourage you to like, subscribe, rate, review, or share this episode with friends. If you'd like to listen to the music we've discussed in this interview, please see the episode description. And if you want to listen or read more about and indeed from John, I would check out his website, johnpsathas.com. If you want to get in touch with me about the podcast, please email sonicspeculations@gmail.com. And I'll be back in another fortnight's time with another episode of the Sonic Speculations podcast.